In 1996, a young Japanese game developer named Inokenji happened to visit a school for the blind during a community event. While walking around, he found some students who were playing a video game, a game he had worked on. Ino's game had been designed for sighted people, but blind students were using their ears to play it. 10 years later, in an interview, he said that, quote, while the students couldn't have the full experience, and they were forcing themselves to be able to play it, they were making an effort to play it as well as sighted players. I thought at the time that if a blind player and I both turned off the screen and played together, we could discuss the game as equals. The idea of equality in experiences would become a staple of Ino's career until his death a few years later, but the games he designed in the past led directly to the present age of blind-friendly gaming and to a new indie game that I hope represents its future. But before we talk about that game, let's delve into the history of blind gaming.
Come on.
The first games that could be played by the blind appeared in the 1970s, but their accessibility was often accidental. Take the arcade game Touch Me in 1974. It was a tall podium with no monitor, just 4 buttons that could each play a distinct tone. The game would play a sequence of tones for you to memorize, and the player would press the buttons in the correct order. Like many games of the 1970s, Touch Me could be played by the blind, but that accessibility was almost never by design. In 1984, Apple PCs introduced Macintalk, which converted text on the computer screen into audio speech you could hear. The blind community soon realized this tech had just opened the entire world of text-based games to them. If you're not familiar with text-based games, events on screen weren't shown through graphics, they were simply described in text, and the player could respond by typing in actions. Thanks to text-to-speech programs, many of those games were technically now blind accessible, but that accessibility was still just incidental, and there were problems with the setup. For example, text games often used wordplays and riddles, which didn't translate perfectly into spoken word sometimes. Consider Leather Goddesses of Phobos, a text-based game from 1986. In the game, a salesman gives you a tool called a T remover, spelled T-E-E. A sighted player would immediately recognize, oh, that's kind of spelled weird, this is probably a riddle. And with a little bit of experimentation, they'd find out that it literally takes the letter T out of things. For example, if you use the T remover on a train, the train would become rain. It's a cool little item, but it ended up being essential to playing the main quest. Since text-to-speech programs pronounce the item simply as
T remover,
a player relying on that tech might not recognize it as a riddle and then spend hours unsure what to do with it. These games were still blind playable though, and that was way better than nothing. But as graphic processing improved, more and more visible elements were being added into games. Eventually, the text-based genre was phased out entirely as sighted users moved over to newer, graphic-focused content. But that's not to say the blind community wasn't trying to play those newer games. They just didn't use their eyes. They were relying on sounds to understand what was happening on screen. For blind users, these sounds are known as audio orientation cues, and if you have enough orientation cues, you can determine everything going on the screen without sight. The more orientation cues you have, the fuller an idea you get of the game and your character's place in it. There are lots of ways that these orientation cues evolved over the years, like spatial sound or audio quality improvements, but the most important change was the developmental shift from narrow audio design to wide audio design. Games in the 1970s and 80s used narrow audio, where there was only a few sounds and each sound would be used for multiple things. Think about how a blind player would experience Sprint 1, a 1978 Atari game. The game only had 4 sounds: go, boost, caution, and crash. The go sound was played no matter how you drove. If you slowed down, if you turned, if you stopped moving, it didn't matter. You just got a go sound. The caution sound was played if a car went over an oil slick, or if a car hit another car. The crash sound was played whenever you hit a side railing, which sounds like an orientation cue blind players could use by learning the shape of the racetrack, except the shape just randomly changed sometimes, so it was impossible to use that cue to learn about your surroundings. There just weren't enough audio cues for a blind person to make sense of what was happening on screen. It's not sound, it's just noise. Now, compare that to 1994's Michael Andretti's IndyCar Challenge. Try to count how many orientation cues you can pick up. Okay, how many cues did you find? Because by my count, there are about 5. 1, your car engine makes a different sound depending on how fast or slow you're going. 2, if you start going off the track, you hear that grass sound effect. 3, you get an alert every time you complete a lap. 4, the game actually tells you if you're going too fast. And 5, if you get too close to another car, there's a Doppler effect sound helping you identify how close it is. Wide audio design like this was beginning to let blind players play new releases competently, but games at this time still weren't blind accessible. It was just the ingenuity and hard work of blind players that were making them blind playable. The first major step up in blind-friendly games wouldn't happen until 1997's Sega Saturn game, Real Sound: Regrets of the Wind, by Eno Kenji, the Japanese developer we talked about at the start of this video. After his experience at that school for the blind, he started working on a truly blind-accessible game with no visuals at all. Everything from the start menu to gameplay was conveyed with sound. In Regrets of the Wind, you played an elementary school student who falls in love with a classmate. You follow them as they get older and direct some adventures they have in Tokyo. The story is conveyed through voiceovers, sound effects, and a narrator, and you play by selecting A or B plot decisions. There was never an English release of the game, but if you'd like to read an English translation, I've left a link down in the description below. Even though I live in Japan, finding a copy of this game was way harder than I thought it was going to be. I spent a whole day going from small game shop to small game shop, just looking for a physical copy of Regrets of the Wind. But at the very last shop of the day, as soon as I mentioned the game, the owner, Mr. Fujita, lit up. He said it was one of his favorite games of all time, and we ended up talking about it for over an hour, its innovations, its impact on the world, and some of its flaws. I told him I was working on a YouTube video that would discuss the game, so I wanted to buy it and a Sega Saturn to play it on. He vanished into the back room, popping out a minute later holding a Sega Saturn and a copy of the game, both of which he gave to me for free. So a huge, giant, mega shout out to Mr. Fujita. He is awesome. Thank you again. Regrets of the Wind didn't sell very well at its release, but Eno's work did make a huge creative splash. He inspired a lot of developers both inside and outside Japan to start making similar blind-friendly content, and his work is generally thought of as the birth of modern blind gaming. And as much as I respect Regrets of the Wind, it wasn't perfect. Even a mega fan like Mr. Fujita agreed it had flaws. In a game about reaching out to blind gamers, it gave them an experience that they could be immersed in, but only through the eyes of a main character who wasn't blind, and who often vocalized what he was experiencing in a way that maybe only a sighted person would find relatable, talking about colors or the beauty of paintings or describing shapes of things off in the distance. Regrets of the Wind made a bold effort to be blind playable, but it wasn't always blind empathetical. Games are about immersion, and putting yourself into a game through the protagonist is a huge aspect of that immersion. For a blind player, an audio description of things the character sees is a not so subtle barrier. Again, tons of respect to the game, it's just that there was still room for improvement. So I finished that game, and I started digging deeper to find more current blind accessible content. That led me to the smartphone blind app market. Starting around 2010, a wave of intentionally blind accessible design apps for phones started arriving. Games like Papa Sangre or The Nightjar brought blind-friendly content into the hands of both blind and sighted users. Touchscreen interfaces and gyroscopes were surprisingly well suited for this, and there's no question these apps were the most blind-friendly content we had ever gotten. But as great as this new market was, it ran into a genre problem. More than 90% of audio games are horror games. I wasn't really sure what to make of this, so I reached out to some blind gamers for their thoughts. While most appreciated that these games existed, blind players were still a little bit frustrated at the reliance on fear as a game concept. Sure, fear is a critical element in horror games for the sighted as well, but we have a huge library of games where you can stand up to monsters and fight back. That was rarely an option in these audio games. To both sighted and blind players, it left an impression of helplessness for players who can't see, and there seems to be very little innovation happening on that front. Of course, not all blind-friendly apps are like this, but the vast majority are. So that's where blind gaming is right now, but what about its future? I want to introduce a game to you, a game that I think represents what the next generation of games for the blind should be like. It's called Lost and Hound. It's a Unity project, currently a demo, and definitely still a work in progress, but it's 100% accessible, friendly, and immersive to both blind and sighted players. Instead of being a voice-narrated game, it's a sound-driven game where audio orientation cues are the ways you perceive and how you interact with the world. It does have a mode with visuals, but you don't need them, and the game is way more fun if you don't use them. And that word, fun, it's important, because I'd argue that until very recently, few blind accessible games could honestly be described as fun. They could be well made, they could have great level design and high quality audio, blah blah blah, but they were rarely exciting. You had to play carefully and anxiously, and that's not really the case with Lost and Hound. For the record, all gameplay you're about to see or hear was recorded from my blindfolded playthrough of this game. Any information that I talk about was expressed to me through sound. The player takes the role of a little corgi named Biscuit. As Biscuit, you walk around areas and help people with their problems. In the demo, you enter a forest area where a local sheriff asks for your help in locating some car crash victims. Joining you is your owner, who follows behind you wherever you were standing a second ago. Your dog hearing lets you pick up the sound of your owner's heartbeat, so no matter where you are, you'll always have that orientation cue of where you've been. You also are accompanied by 2 other dogs that move around your general area. If Biscuit barks, they'll bark as well, so you always know where they are. Any objects you get close to are detectable with a ticking sound based on your distance. Small objects can be picked up and carried if you want to use them as a customizable audio cue. The level design is one massive macro orientation cue. Forest areas sound like a forest. Areas near the creek play frog sound effects, accompanied by the sound of rushing water. Open fields use a minimalist audio design, so you kind of know if you're between 2 different environment types. There are lots of smaller but useful cues as well, like these 2 rams that would only appear near the middle of the creek, so if I heard them, I knew I was going to be close to the center of the map. So, okay, you can generally figure out what's going on around you, but how do you interact with the world? Weirdly enough, you have to use your nose. When Biscuit sniffs the ground, his dog's heightened sense of smell is expressed as sound to the player. So if you're looking for something, say the car crash, just sniff and the game will give you an audio cue of where that goal is. Even with all these cues, I played quite slowly at first. I was worried about getting lost, so I was constantly stopping to orient myself and never using the run button. I was too scared to really trust in my own hearing. After a few minutes of walking around, I did find the car crash, but the passengers weren't there, so I had to start following their scent. At this point, the game gets a little bit more challenging. I'm told there are wolves in the area, so I need to keep an ear out for growling. It did not take long for me to run into my first wolf, and truth be told, it was a little bit terrifying and a little bit disappointing. I was annoyed that the game was starting to lean on fear like 90% of those phone apps from before. But that's not what happened. See, wolves would only approach me if my group was spread out. So if I heard a wolf getting close, all I had to do was call the other 2 dogs in my group and they'd come together and they'd get behind me. When they do, the wolves back off. So while the wolves do represent danger, I don't have to run from them. I can stand my ground and face them down. That is, it sounds like a small thing to emphasize, but after playing so many audio games where I constantly felt helpless, this was a very refreshing mechanic. I started getting a lot more confident with my movement and comfortable in relying on my hearing. It was okay to make mistakes because the game was giving me all the tools I needed to find my way back from those mistakes. I started playing a lot less hesitantly, sometimes experimenting even with running in short bursts. Pretty soon, I found one of the car crash victims and I guided her back to an ambulance. She told me she was actually with her son and they got separated in the forest, so I headed out, this time a little bit more familiar with the environment, and eventually I did find him. But he's frightened and he's lost, so I had to earn his trust. I found a stick on the ground, I brought it to him, and we played a game of fetch together. This little game of fetch, it was one of the coolest moments in gaming I have ever experienced. Lost and Hound had been teaching me to rely on my hearing with more and more audio cues. My owner, the forest, the ticking sound of the stick, the barks from my dog team. When that kid threw the stick and I heard it flying through the air, it felt like everything clicked. And I didn't hesitate for a second to run after it at full speed. I raced straight under the stick as it flew, knowing exactly where it was and where it was going. All of my reluctance from the beginning of the game was wiped away in a second. I still don't even know how to explain why this moment was so impactful, but at this point, I started feeling empowered, not hindered by only having my hearing. It felt like a superpower. I didn't need my eyes, I could sense the object. After playing fetch, the group will start heading back towards the ambulance, but a storm moves in and it adds a new element to the game: thunder. Every few minutes or so, thunder would briefly overpower other audio cues, encouraging you to stop for a second and check your orientation. But the storm doesn't make you feel helpless, it just makes you feel like you have to play smart. Difficulty increases are what keep games engaging, and the addition of thunder was reminiscent of Mario level design theory. Early levels you can race through without much worry once you feel confident with the controls, but in final stages you have to take a moment and consider your approach, even if you're good at the game. Thunder didn't make the game scary, it just made the game more challenging, and that made the game better. The group does make it back, and all the characters who helped thank you. I really enjoyed this moment. I thought it was nice how the game takes a second to emphasize how helpful you were instead of just giving a quick "you did it" screen or something. A good blind-friendly game keeps its audience in mind, and the genius of this game goes beyond its mechanics and how you play. It's about who you play as. You don't just play some dog, you get to play a rescue dog. You're constantly being relied on by people who need your help. That's a total reversal of how society usually perceives the blind community's abilities. Sure, in media, they're often portrayed as tough and self-reliant, like Matt Murdock, the Marvel superhero in Daredevil, or Toph the Earthbender in the Last Airbender animated series, but it's not really how society sees them. In day-to-day life, many people view the blind as equals, but unfortunately as equals who can't help sighted people. It's a bad but common viewpoint, but in Lost and Hound, that dynamic is flipped. You're the only one who can save everyone. You don't need help. People need your help. You get to rescue people. You help them get to places they need to go, and you get to enjoy a couple of words of appreciation for it at the end. That's a very empowering concept. You know, after finishing this game, I started thinking about how small the game library really is for blind players. Don't get me wrong, it would be unreasonable to expect every video game to be fully blind accessible, but with just a few more games like Lost and Hound, maybe we could have something like what Inokenji thought of 25 years ago. Sighted players and blind players sitting down, turning off the screen, and having a conversation as true equals in our experience. Doesn't that sound pretty good? As always, thanks for watching or listening. In the description, you'll find links to a full text script of this video, Lost and Hound Steam page, and of course my Patreon. Have a chill week. I hope you enjoyed the video and hope to talk to you soon. Bye.